I was 14 years old when a new student transferred to my boarding school just 2 weeks before the term exams. He was my age, my height, and shared many of my interests: tennis, mangoes, Naruto, and winning 11. But if I'm being honest, Paul was better looking than I was. No, actually, he was way better looking. And as if that weren't enough, he was also more intelligent. Normally, my school wouldn't admit a new student so late in the term, but Paul was an exception. His academic records spoke for themselves. He had the highest scores in nearly every subject, leaving just mathematics for me and fine art for the renowned class artists. Even then, he came in second in both. The girls in school were particularly taken by him. Whenever he walked past, their excited whispers would drop to hushed tones, eventually trailing off into polite greetings. I was playing my brick game in class when Paul approached me, catching me off guard with an unexpected question. "Who are Peter and Patrick?" Apparently, he had overheard the girls whispering as he passed by, comparing him to two other students. He had no idea why they kept saying he looked exactly like his brothers, Peter and Patrick. I almost laughed at his confusion. Not only did I know he didn't have any brothers, but now I had to show him why people thought otherwise. I took him to the senior block, where he had never been before. As soon as we stepped into the classroom, Paul's eyes widened in disbelief. Sitting there were two senior students, identical to him in every way. The entire senior class fell into stunned silence before erupting into a chorus of exclamations. "Are you guys sure you're not brothers? What about cousins? They must be messing with us." But Peter and Patrick, both 17, reaffirmed that they were their mother's only children. They had no brothers, no lost twins, nothing. Paul, equally baffled, insisted he was an only child. Then, after a pause, he added something that caught everyone's attention. "Maybe I would have had siblings, if not for an old tragedy." The seniors pressed him for details that even I, his closest friend, had never heard before. And so, standing in the middle of a classroom full of curious students, Paul told us about his parents. A young graduate in his early 20s landed a job at an oil company and married the love of his life. A few months into their marriage, his wife began to feel ill, so he took her to the hospital. The doctor, after listening to her symptoms and running a few tests, gave them unexpected news. She was pregnant. Overjoyed, they played old disco songs and danced in the car on their way home. But their joy was short-lived. Tragedy struck in the form of a fatal car accident. His pregnant wife didn't survive. For a year, the young man grieved, drowning in mourning and depression. Then one day, his father received a message from his late wife's family. They wanted to see him, so accompanied by his own father, he visited his in-laws. During the meeting, they called for the deceased woman's younger sister, who nervously recounted a dream she had been having for months. "My sister comes to me every night," she said. "She begs me, over and over again, 'Please marry my husband. Don't let him die of grief. You and I are so much alike. Having you will rekindle his spirit, and I will find a way to send the children to him.'" A heavy silence settled over the room. No one attempted to explain the meaning of her words. But the young man, still grieving, finally spoke. "My wife was pregnant when she died." Days passed. Eventually, the young man's father approached him with a suggestion. If he was willing, he should marry his late wife's younger sister. After all, she was about to graduate from university. And so the young man completed the marital rites, taking his wife's sister as his new wife. Paul exhaled sharply. "So," he said with a small, ironic smile, "that's how my dad lost the woman who would have been my mom, and how my mom lost the woman who should have been my mom and my cousin." A heavy silence followed Paul's story, like an unshakable presence in the room. No one spoke, no one moved, until the sharp ring of the school bell shattered the moment, signaling the start of afternoon classes. Before we left, Peter and Patrick invited Paul and me to their house after school, eager for their mother to meet someone who shared their face. I initially agreed, but later decided against it, citing the fact that, unlike them, I was a boarding student and couldn't leave the school premises so freely. The real reason? I had a terrible case of stomach cramps after school and needed some serious quality time in the toilet. The next morning, chaos descended upon the school. Police officers arrived with Peter and Patrick, their expressions grim. Their mother had vanished overnight. As protocol demanded, the authorities were there to question the last people known to have seen her, Paul included. Paul's father had just dropped him off at school when the officers arrived. At first, he refused to let them speak to his son, but after some insistence, he reluctantly relented. Paul recounted the events of the previous evening. According to him, the twins' mother had greeted him warmly, almost as if she had been expecting him. She served them lunch, smiling kindly as she spoke. Then, before he left, she turned to him with a peculiar message. "Tell your mother, thank you, my sister, for taking care of my husband. And tell your father, the twins are yours. I have delivered the children to you." Then, as if wanting to commemorate the moment, they had taken a picture together on their phones. Paul's father, who had been listening impatiently, scoffed. "Father? Sister?" He turned to the officers. "You see, this is why I didn't want you questioning my son. These kids play too much and talk nonsense." Then, as if to prove his point, he folded his arms and said, "All right, where's this photo you're talking about?" That was when I saw the first real flicker of fear cross Paul's face. His father had just asked him to bring out his phone, something strictly forbidden in school. If a student was caught with a phone, it would be confiscated for the rest of the term, but refusing wasn't an option, so Paul hesitantly pulled it from his pocket and opened the gallery. The moment his father's eyes fell on the screen, the color drained from his face. His hands trembled. "That's her," he whispered hoarsely. "My wife. She died 17 years ago." A thick, suffocating silence settled over the room. The police, growing more alarmed, insisted on speaking with Paul's mother. They accompanied Paul's family to Peter and Patrick's house, where the twins' home was adorned with framed portraits of their missing mother. Paul later told me that as soon as his parents stepped inside, his father's eyes welled up with tears and his mother froze in place. They both confirmed the same impossible truth. The woman in the portraits was identical to Paul's father's late wife, Paul's aunt. Days turned into weeks, yet the twins' mother was never found. Back in the village, Paul's grandmother had a very different reaction to the news. Instead of grief, she rejoiced like thighs, her voice ringing through the air daily. "My first daughter has given us the grandchildren she promised," she declared, beaming. At first, people dismissed her as senile, but as whispers of supernatural forces began to spread, the village chief sought a way to put the rumors to rest. He proposed a DNA test, believing that cold hard science would disprove the wild claims. The police, already baffled by the case, welcomed the idea. The results, however, defied every known law of reality. The paternity test confirmed that Peter and Patrick were, without a doubt, Paul's father's biological children, which meant they weren't just lookalikes. They were Paul's older brothers, born 2 years before him. But the real shock came with the maternity test. While Paul's mother shared no direct maternal connection to the twins, the results suggested something else: an aunt-nephew relationship. Further tests were conducted using Paul's grandparents, and once again, the results confirmed that the twins were biologically linked to their supposed grandparents, not just as distant relatives, but as their actual grandchildren. This left only one question: if the twins were indeed Paul's father's sons, then who was their mother? The police, hoping to put an end to the mystery, secured an order to exhume the grave of Paul's late aunt, the woman now believed to be the twins' mother. When they dug up her remains, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place. A DNA test confirmed, beyond any doubt, that the corpse buried 18 years ago was the biological mother of Peter and Patrick. There was just one problem: she had been dead for 18 years, and yet the twins were only 17 years old. The police, ever lazy and incompetent in my country, wanted nothing to do with something they couldn't explain. They quietly closed the case, abandoning Peter and Patrick with Paul's family and issuing a dismissive public statement. The twin children of the missing woman have been reunited with their family. The missing mom appears to have passed on and been laid to rest. There is no supernatural element to this case. Paul's grandmother, however, gathered the twin boys in her arms and said something that has run cold in me ever since I heard it. She showed them a picture. "Hey, this girl looks like our mom," said Patrick. "Yes," said Grandma. "This was your mom when she was a teenage girl. Your mother stayed longer than she was allowed," she said softly. "She raised you, and now she has returned you to your father. It is done." That was the last anyone ever saw of the mysterious woman. As for Paul's father, he formally adopted Peter and Patrick, raising them as his own sons because, in truth, they were his sons. Life went on. I eventually lost touch with Paul. The last time I heard from him was in 2013, and that was it. I hadn't thought about any of them in years, until today when I stumbled upon Peter's Facebook profile. He had a wife now, a family, a normal life. And yet, I couldn't help but wonder, had he ever found the answers to the questions we never dared to ask? I had never believed in the preternatural, the paranormal, or the mythical. A staunch atheist and a man of reason, I dismissed such notions as superstitious drivel. But the events of that night shattered my convictions and left me forever changed. Now I find myself looking over my shoulder, hoping that someone out there might recognize what I've encountered and tell me if my paranoia is justified. It had been only a month since I was introduced to Christopher. His reputation preceded him, arriving at Easton already tainted by the grim attention of news outlets. Easton had long been known, rather infamously, as the place where parents sent developmentally disabled children they couldn't handle. A cruel stigma, no doubt, but despite public perception, we prided ourselves on our work. We were a full-fledged boarding school with a sprawling campus, home to roughly 500 students between the ages of 9 and 22. Our focus wasn't traditional academics, but functional skills, equipping these children with the tools they'd need to navigate life once they inevitably transitioned into group homes. I worked the second shift in B Wing, the most challenging of them all. This 10-story facility housed the most behaviorally volatile students, a self-contained world outfitted with state-of-the-art dorms, classrooms, gyms, an indoor pool, kitchens, and even a mini grocery store. The idea was to minimize their need to leave the building, but I always disagreed with that approach. Isolation, after all, rarely did anyone good. Christopher's arrival was met with unease. He had made national headlines after stabbing his own mother more than 20 times during what doctors classified as a schizophrenic episode. But the true reason his case became a public fascination lay in his backstory. Most of our students were either born with their conditions, autism, Down syndrome, fetal alcohol syndrome, or had suffered acquired brain injuries. They had received intensive therapeutic services from early childhood, their diagnoses forming the fabric of their lives. Christopher, however, was an anomaly. He had been born perfectly normal, an intelligent, socially adept boy. He was a B-average student, had friends, crushes, teenage worries, and even a paper route. Then, one day, everything changed. It happened overnight, right around his 13th birthday. The parents described it as if someone had flipped a switch. He went to bed as the son they knew and woke up someone else entirely. Chaos followed. That morning was filled with violence, incoherent screaming, and eventually bloodshed. By the time his father managed to restrain him, Christopher's mother was barely clinging to life. The boy was hospitalized, and it was there that doctors delivered their baffling diagnosis: full-blown schizophrenia with an unusual intensity. The specialist list identified 3 distinct voices tormenting him. 2 were persistent but manageable, but the third, Topaz, was something else entirely. Each time Topaz surfaced, Christopher made an attempt on someone's life. It was Topaz who had urged him to stab his mother. The voices defied conventional treatment, leaving doctors scrambling for years to find the right cocktail of medications. Eventually, they succeeded, at least to an extent. While the voices never fully disappeared, the medication managed to suppress Topaz entirely. For 2 years, the entity had remained silent, and with that milestone, Christopher was deemed fit for reintegration. At 20 years old, he was placed under our care. I remember our first meeting vividly. Christopher was impossibly tall, at least 6'6", and almost skeletal. His skin had an unsettling mottled appearance, like bruised fruit stretched too tightly over bone. He rarely made eye contact, but when he did, his gaze was piercing, almost unnatural. His demeanor fluctuated in a way that made me question if there was something more than schizophrenia at play. One moment he was silent, meek, responding in single-word murmurs, yes, no, The next, he was mischievous, articulate, and antagonistic, tormenting staff and residents alike. We had our hands full with him. Then came the night that changed everything. It was about an hour before the end of my shift. My team that night was solid. We had a good rhythm, working through our logs, while most of the students were fast asleep. Christopher, however, was still awake, pacing the common area and taunting another resident. I left the office to intervene, stepping into the massive lounge that served as the lobby. Bal was already there, caught in the middle of their spat. Though small in stature, Bal was fearless. Most female staff avoided being alone with Christopher, wary of his past, but she met him head-on. Later, in private, she'd confessed to being terrified, but in that moment she showed no fear. What happened next would redefine everything I believed. It's 'cause he's a little bitch. F*** you, Kreese, you have your own games. You lost 2. You take mine. Kyle was a good kid. A bit of trouble on his own, sure, but always pure-hearted. Standing barely 5 feet tall with Down syndrome, he was no match for Christopher, who towered over him like a shadow stretching across the room. You suck at games anyway, Christopher sneered, shoving Kyle's shoulder. Give them to me. He held out his hand, demanding the Nintendo. Bal stepped in. Christopher, enough. It's 10:15, and people are sleeping. Tone it down and go to bed. I will not. His lips curled into a slow, knowing grin. Yes, you will, I interjected. He turned to face me, his piercing gaze locking onto mine. This is the 3rd time I've had to address you tonight. You're a grown man now, so make a grown decision. The grin remained, but it changed. Something about it became sharper, more deliberate. Sorry. He raised his hands in mock surrender. Kyle owes me some games, that's all. I do not. You'll have 0 games in a moment, Bal warned, her tone cutting through the air, and it'll stay that way for a week. Christopher spun back around, his arms flailing like loose Twizzlers. Shut up, cunt. I was about to step in, but Bal had already closed the distance between them. She squared up to him, unflinching. Or else what? A silence settled between them, thick with tension. They locked eyes, neither willing to break first. Then, with an exaggerated wave of his hand, Christopher dismissed her, sucking his teeth in irritation. But before retreating, he turned back to Kyle, voice dripping with condescension. Baby needs mommy to protect him again? I thought we were grown men. With a dramatic sigh, he collapsed onto the couch, pretending to watch TV while fidgeting with his fingers. Bal and I exchanged a look. I pointed to my radio and she gave a subtle nod, sighing before turning to Kyle, who still looked ready to lunge at him. I shook my head and left for the office. The nights were long enough as it was, but Christopher made them feel endless. Since his arrival, several staff had already put in their resignations. I'd be lying if I said I hadn't considered it myself. Back in the office, I vented to my coworkers, the usual tirade of frustration pouring out. We were still sorting through paperwork when the sound of a sharp squeal pierced through the halls, followed by the screeching drag of furniture scraping violently across the floor. Then Bal's voice came over the radio. Franco, I need you here. Now. I exchanged glances with the others before bolting out the door. There was something in her voice, an edge of urgency I hadn't heard before. When I rounded the corner into the common area, my stomach twisted. Bal was kneeling on the floor, holding Kyle's head in a protective grip. His eyes were bloodshot, his breath uneven, and the red marks around his neck painted a clear picture of what had just happened. My gaze snapped to Christopher, who stood off to the side, staring blankly at nothing. You stay right there. Bal's voice cut through the room like a blade. Christopher's eyes flickered between her and Kyle, his movements jittery, almost frantic. What happened? I demanded. He happened, Bal muttered, still holding on to Kyle, who struggled to form words through ragged breaths. He lunged at him. What the f*** did you do, Christopher? My words came out like venom, but I didn't care. Christopher met my glare with a vacant expression. His face gave nothing away, but his body language screamed guilt. I said, What the f*** did you do? My voice rose. My hands curled into fists. I wasn't proud of my reaction, but I wasn't sure if we were dealing with Christopher anymore, or if Topaz had finally surfaced after all these years. I grabbed my radio. Possible Indigo, I need everyone in the lobby. Bal's walkie crackled as my voice echoed through it, amplifying the tension already suffocating the room. Christopher's back hit the wall as he shrank into himself, his eyes darting wildly between us. Franco, Bal spoke low, controlled. He would have killed him if I hadn't stepped in. My mind snapped to the crisis protocols outlined in Christopher's file. Crisis Protocol. Subject, Christopher Tavern. Should you suspect Topaz has surfaced, approach with extreme caution. A minimum 3-to-1 staff ratio is required. Signs of Topaz's presence include but are not limited to sudden bursts of extreme violence, explosive physical movements, an unblinking, affixed gaze, a targeted look that suggests Topaz has locked onto an individual with intent to harm, repetitive twitching, anxious tapping at the eyeball, or covering of the ears. Should Topaz be suspected, immediately address the subject by their full name, Christopher Tavern. Ask if Topaz is present. If confirmed, demand that Christopher bid him farewell. Instruct him to say goodbye to Topaz. If non-compliant, administer a PRN dose of clozapine. Should these measures fail, staff discretion is advised. Contact emergency personnel and initiate physical restraint if necessary. I stepped toward him. Christopher Tavern. His face was still, too still. Is Topaz here with us? A pause. Are you sure? Another beat of silence. Yes. Then what happened here? No response. Christopher, talk to me. Kyle was choking. I clenched my jaw. No, we're not doing right now. I need an explanation. Kyle almost... Fucking hell, guy, what happened? I grabbed the fabric of his shirt, yanking him forward slightly. His eyes flicked toward Kyle, then to me. And that's when I saw it. The switch. His entire demeanor shifted, his body stiffened, and a look of pure, seething hatred distorted his face. His gaze sharpened, locking onto Bal with an intensity I'd only seen in predators before they strike. The air around us felt different, charged. An instinct I couldn't explain took over. I shoved him hard against the wall, my grip tightening on his collar. Christopher Tavern, I commanded, my voice a snarl. Bid Topaz farewell? His expression didn't change. The hatred didn't waver. It was pouring off of him, thick and suffocating. Christopher Tavern! I slammed him again, more forcefully this time. Bid Topaz farewell. Nothing. I exhaled sharply. If he wouldn't listen to Christopher, maybe he'd listen to me. Topaz, I said, speaking directly to whatever the hell was staring back at me through Christopher's eyes. If you don't leave right now, I will take Christopher away from you. The room fell silent, and then something changed. A momentary pause. I held the man in front of me. For someone his size, I was shocked by how weightless he felt, like I was gripping a hollow frame, something too light to be real. The other staff had gathered behind me, though I hadn't noticed their arrival. My focus had tunneled, instincts honed solely on protecting Bal. But now, with backup, I took a step back and surveyed the room. Then I looked at Christopher. His expression had shifted. The aggression, the malice, it was gone. What remained was something fragile. Regret, sorrow, and something else. It was the look a dog gives when it's caught in the trash, head hung low, eyes pleading for forgiveness, as if fully aware of the wrongdoing. I almost felt bad for him, reminded that beneath the violence, he was still just a boy. But as relief crept in, convincing me that Topaz had finally left, I saw it. A darkness. Not in his expression, but in his eyes. A void, not empty, but full of something unnatural. It was as if I had stared too deeply, past the surface and into the abyss beneath. They say the eyes are windows to the soul. At that moment, I believed it. Christopher's face changed again. Panic overtook him. His body tensed as realization dawned. He knew I had seen something I wasn't meant to. And just like that, he ran. His speed was unnatural, impossible. A blur of movement as he shoved through chairs and desks with shocking ease. I barely had time to react before instinct took over. I chased after him, Bal's sharp gasp ringing in my ears as the others followed close behind. Through the lobby, his movements zigzagged in ways that made no sense, erratic yet deliberate. There was something inhuman about the way he ran. I should have stopped. I should have turned back, but I didn't. We reached the end of the lobby. Christopher skidded to a stop, his back pressing against the wall beneath the massive window. His chest heaved, rising and falling like a bellows. And then, for the second time that night, our eyes met. The void had deepened. Time slowed. I felt it in my gut, a sensation so primal, so unnatural that every instinct screamed at me to run. But I was frozen. His eyes told me I wasn't supposed to be here, that I shouldn't have seen him. Then he spun around, hands clawed at the window latch. No! I lunged, fingers grazing his shirt, but I was too late. The window burst open, and Christopher plunged headfirst into the night. I threw myself forward, heart slamming against my ribs as I watched his body fall. Suicide? Thoughts crashed through my mind like shattered glass. What will I tell his family? How will the news cover this? What if the others see his body? Will I be blamed for this? Then something changed. His body twisted midair, legs arching, arms tucking against his sides in an unnatural motion. I expected a sickening crash, expected the pavement to claim him in a mess of blood and bone. It didn't. Instead, his body swooped, not like someone falling, but like something pulling up. A pair of wings exploded from his back. Not feathers, not leather. Something worse. Stretched human skin, taut and warped, veins crawling across their surface. The grotesque anatomy of something that should not exist. I felt the force of his takeoff as he shot past the window with a single powerful beat, and then he was gone. Silence. I collapsed onto the floor, my hands trembling against the cold tile. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. My mind replayed the last second in an endless loop, begging to rewrite reality into something that made sense. But what I saw was impossible. Something not meant for human comprehension. Something evil. Topaz will return. I know he will. The investigation into Christopher's disappearance is still ongoing, but the others, they only saw him jump. They didn't see the wings. They didn't see him fly. I don't know how much time I have before he comes back. But if anyone out there has seen something like this, if you know what I encountered, please, tell me. I can't keep living in fear. I need to understand what walks among us. May God have mercy on our souls.